I want to say something upfront, as clearly as I can manage. When I reference texts like the Emerald Tablet, the Zohar, the Corpus Hermeticum, the Upanishads, or Sufi metaphysical writings, I'm not arguing that any of them are objectively true. I'm not trying to smuggle belief into observation or build a case for any particular cosmology. I'm definitely not recruiting. I think the thing that interests me is patterns. Patterns that I've noticed over years of reading, teaching meditation, and watching people move through breakdowns and awakenings. Patterns in which books tend to appear at certain moments in a person's life, because something in the person suddenly becomes ready for these books. These texts usually show up when something else has stopped working, and I think that timing is worth paying attention to. I think there is a shift that happens in a person's relationship to books, usually after something breaks. I think that's the moment people stop reading for answers. I think early on we read to collect information, arguments, frameworks, and ammunition for debates we're having with ourselves or other people. Reading is a process of acquisition. It's like we're building something. Then something collapses. Maybe it's a relationship, a belief system, a sense of who we are and where we're headed. And the collecting stops being satisfying because the thing you were building it for no longer exists in the same form. It seems like that's when reading changes character entirely. You're suddenly not asking what's true anymore. You're asking something more subtle and harder to articulate. What am I inside of? You're trying to find the walls of the room you're in. From my experience, this is usually when the old metaphysical texts enter the picture. They might look like doctrines and belief systems demanding subscription, but they're more like, and I know I keep coming back to this word, mirrors. It's not a loud arrival. They don't just smash through your wall. They show up in side references, in late night searches, in a quote someone drops in a conversation that lands differently than it should have. And once they're here, they seem to stay. They have a quality of already being half familiar, and of describing something you recognized before you could name it. I think the question worth asking isn't whether they're true, but why they keep arriving at the same moments in different people's lives, across time. The Emerald Tablet is almost frustratingly short for the amount of attention it's received across 14 centuries. It's just a fragment, dense, gnomic, attributed in various traditions to Hermes Trismegistus, the mythological figure who bridges Greek and Egyptian wisdom traditions. No one knows its true origin. The earliest versions we have are Arabic translations from around the 8th century CE. Its central line, as above, so below, as within, so without, has been quoted so many times that it's nearly lost its meaning, which is unfortunate because when you actually sit with it, it's pointing at something genuinely strange. The Hermetic principle of correspondence proposes that reality is self-similar across scales, that the same patterns that organize the cosmos organize the psyche, that inner states and outer conditions mirror each other, not metaphorically, but in a structural way. This sounds mystical until you notice how often it turns out to be practically true. Trauma researchers describe exactly this correspondence, the way unresolved interior states pattern themselves into the external circumstances of a life with almost mechanical consistency. The therapeutic insight that inner change must be accompanied by embodied behavioral change, or it doesn't hold, maps directly onto the tablet's refusal to privilege either the above or the below. Neither level is more real. Both require the same amount of attention. The physicist, David Bohm, working without any mystical agenda, spent his career arguing that reality has what he called an implicit order, a deeper level of structure from which the ordinary surface-level world unfolds. The correspondence between inner and outer in his framework is not a mystical claim, but a consequence of both arising from the same underlying organization. I don't think the Emerald Tablet is trying to convince you of anything. It seems more interested in training your perception, in teaching someone to think in systems rather than fragments, to look for the pattern that connects rather than the explanation that isolates. That training seems as useful now as it apparently was in 8th century Baghdad. And even though there's a lot of strange stuff going on in the world right now, I do want to talk about the Zohar and the feeling that reality is responsive. The Zohar is the foundational text of Kabbalah, written or compiled in 13th century Spain, attributed mystically to the 2nd century rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, or Yoche. I guess it's Yoche, maybe it's Yochai, though modern scholarship credits the Spanish mystic Moses de Leon. I think it's one of the strangest and most psychologically sophisticated texts in the Western tradition. What it describes at its core is a universe that is alive, unfinished, and participatory. In the Zoharic universe, human beings are not spectators of a fixed reality. They are active participants in its ongoing construction. The concept of tikkun olam, repair of the world, proposes that the cosmos is not complete and that human action, human attention, human ethical life genuinely contributes to its unfolding. And this isn't symbolism, they mean it in a structural way. Of course, if this is taken literally, it can sound extravagant, but if we take it psychologically, it feels almost obvious. Stories shape people. Meaning organizes behavior. Attention determines what you actually encounter in your experience as opposed to what technically passes through your sensory field. The ethical quality of how you move through the world affects how the world feels to inhabit, not just for you, but for everyone you come into contact with. Now, these definitely aren't mystical propositions. These are descriptions of how consciousness actually functions, confirmed by every serious tradition of contemplative practice and increasingly supported by research in neuroscience. The Zohar's specific contribution is the Sephirot, 10 attributes or emanations through which the divine manifests in the world, often depicted as a tree-like structure called the Etz Chaim, or Etz Chaim. Etz Chaim. I really can't say all these words, but you don't have to know how to say a word to know a thing, right? Or we can just call it the Tree of Life. These aren't gods or separate beings. They're more like, and this is just my reading, I'm sure others would put it differently, dimensions of experience, qualities of reality that the fully developed human being learns to navigate consciously rather than being pushed around by unconsciously. The thing that strikes me about the Zohar is how often people who've never touched it arrive at structurally similar conclusions through depth psychology, systems study, or even serious contemplative practice. The Zohar just seems to have gotten there earlier, using mythic language in place of clinical vocabulary. And then there are the Hermetic texts and the theme of forgetting. The Corpus Hermeticum is a collection of Greek texts written in Egypt somewhere between the 1st and 3rd centuries CE, rediscovered in 15th century Florence and translated by Marsilio Ficino. This was a translation that genuinely changed European intellectual history. These texts are dialogues between Hermes Trismegistus, thrice greatest Hermes, a figure who blends the Greek Hermes with the Egyptian Thoth, and his students. Their central diagnosis of the human situation is not sin or failure or weakness. It's forgetting. The problem, in the Hermetic framework, is that the soul has become so absorbed in the material world, in its urgencies, its demands, its relentless presentness, that it has forgotten its larger context. It has mistaken the immediate for the total. It has forgotten that it is more than what the moment says it is. This isn't an ancient problem either. Walk into any therapy room, any meditation retreat, any honest conversation with a person in crisis, and you will hear some version of it. I feel disconnected. I feel like I'm on autopilot. I feel like I've lost myself somewhere. I don't know who I am without this relationship, this job, this version of my life. And while these seem like complaints about external circumstances, they're actually descriptions of the specific disorientation the Hermetic texts were describing 2,000 years ago. The Hermetic response isn't prescription. There are no rules. It offers anamnesis, the Greek word for unforgetting, for the recovery of what was always there. The idea that awakening is not acquiring something new, but recovering contact with something that was never actually absent, only obscured. The philosopher Plato used the same concept. So did the Gnostics. In their own vocabulary, so do most serious contemplative traditions. To me, this convergence suggests they're all pointing at something real about how consciousness works, that there is a deeper level of knowledge that ordinary distraction and ordinary urgency consistently cover over, and that what people call awakening is often simply the removal of that covering. I mean, you can see I'm going all over the place from Hermeticism to Kabbalah, but I guess we do have to talk about the Upanishads, which are a collection of philosophical texts composed in Sanskrit between roughly 800 and 200 BCE, forming the conceptual foundation of Hindu philosophy and later of Vedanta. There are over 200 of them. The principal ones, the Brihadaranyaka, I think I said that right, the Chandogya, the Kena, and the Katha were called by Schopenhauer the most rewarding reading the world has to offer, which is high praise from someone not known for his generosity. I think the thing that makes the Upanishads strange, and what makes them keep arriving in people's lives at particular moments, is that they aren't argumentative. They're just pointing you in a direction. Thoughts change, emotions change, the body changes, roles change, beliefs change, opinions change, circumstances change. And if this is true, what exactly is the self? What is the thing that persists through all this change, that seems to be aware of the changing, and that doesn't itself seem to change in the same way the contents of awareness change? The Upanishads call this Atman, the individual self or soul, and propose that it is not ultimately separate from Brahman, the universal ground of consciousness. The famous formula is, and I don't know how to say this, you are not a small, isolated consciousness having experiences in a meaningless universe. You are the awareness in which the universe itself arises. This sounds mystical, but notice what happens when you engage with it experientially rather than philosophically. When you actually sit with the question, who is aware of this experience? I think something loosens. The usual sense of being a small, embattled self inside a threatening world becomes, for a moment, less solid, less automatically convincing. Modern neuroscience is in the early stages of describing what happens to the brain during ego dissolution, states where the default mode network, the neural substrate of self-referential thought, becomes temporarily quiet. Research on meditation, on psychedelic experiences, on certain forms of deep trauma processing, all describe something consistent. Moments where the ordinary sense of being a me, separate from experience, becomes permeable, and something that the Upanishads would recognize emerges in its place. Whether you call it Brahman, or presence, or simply the absence of the usual noise, the experience seems consistent across very different routes to it. and that's something to think about. And I know I'm mixing a lot of stuff, and for any purists, this is probably a nightmare, but I think there's overlap in all of the things I'm talking about, and I think you'll see it too. Sufi metaphysical writing doesn't feel primarily interested in explanation. It seems to be preoccupied with intimacy. The central concept of Sufi metaphysics is ishq, divine love, or more accurately, the love that moves between the human and the divine in both directions. Longing in this tradition is not a problem to be solved or a deficiency to be corrected. It's more like a signal. The ache for connection, for beauty, for meaning, for something that exceeds what ordinary life provides isn't some kind of pathology. It's perception might be the right word to use. The heart in Sufi understanding isn't a sentimental organ, it's a perceptual one. Let's talk about the 13th century poet and mystic Rumi, Jalaluddin Muhammad Rumi, who was born in what is now Afghanistan, and whose most famous works include the Masnavi. His masterpiece opens with the image of the reed flute crying for the reed bed it was cut from. Of course, this could be seen as artistic melodrama, but the reed's longing is the organizing metaphor for the entire spiritual path. Separation as the engine of seeking, seeking as the path to reunion, and reunion as the discovery that the separation was never what it appeared to be. The Persian mystic Ibn Arabi was around in the 12th to 13th century and was one of the most technically sophisticated, and from my perspective was one of the most technically sophisticated metaphysicians in any tradition. He developed the concept of Wadat al-Wujud, the unity of being, the idea that all of existence is a single reality appearing in infinite forms, and that the spiritual path is the gradual recognition of this, the dissolution of the conviction that you are separate from what you long for. What I've noticed, watching people over the years, is that interest in spirituality almost never arises from comfort. It seems to arise from heartbreak, from loss, from love so intense it breaks the ordinary categories. Sufi texts don't pathologize that entry point. They treat it as the door. They suggest that the thing that breaks you open is doing you a service, that the ache is already the beginning of the answer. I keep seeing the same movement and pattern beneath these texts and traditions. A person senses that the surface explanation of their life is insufficient, that there's more happening than the official story accounts for. They feel fragmented, overstimulated, disconnected from something they can't quite name. They turn inward, not to escape the world, but to find a way back into it that doesn't require pretending the depth isn't there. I don't think these texts give the same answers. The Zohar and the Upanishads disagree on fundamental metaphysical questions. The Hermeticists and the Sufis use completely different vocabularies for what might be the same territory. You could actually spend your whole career or life mapping the theological incompatibilities. But they ask the same questions, and they do something else, something subtle but worth talking about. They slow perception down. Reading them, seriously, has the effect of expanding your attention span, of replacing the reflexive reaction with something more like genuine reflection. They seem to create interior space where there wasn't any before. Whether or not their cosmological claims are correct, this effect seems real and measurable. People come out of serious engagement with these texts changed in specific ways that secular self-help, for all its virtues, doesn't consistently produce. The philosopher and scholar of religion Houston Smith spent his career arguing that the great wisdom traditions are not competing explanations of the same reality, but complementary maps of a territory that exceeds any single map. No tradition gets it completely right, but all of them are pointing at something that is genuinely there. I think the intelligent approach is not to pick one and dismiss the others, but to learn to read across them, to develop what he called stereoscopic vision, the capacity to see more dimensionally by holding multiple perspectives at once. That's the spirit I'd bring to any of these texts, and have in the past when I've read them. I think there are a few others worth naming. They belong in this conversation. There's the Nag Hammadi writings, Gnostic texts discovered in Egypt in 1945, buried for 17 centuries, describing a layered reality in which the ordinary world is a partial and easily mistaken version of something larger. The Gospel of Thomas was included among them and contains sayings attributed to Jesus that don't appear in the canonical Gospels and have a quality closer to Zen koan than theological instruction. Of course, there's the Tao Te Ching attributed to Loza, but I'll just say Laozi, which refuses explanation entirely and instead attempts to gesture toward a way of moving with reality rather than against it. The Tao cannot be defined. Defining it collapses it into something smaller than itself. And it does seem like mystical evasion, but it's more a precise philosophical claim about the limits of propositional language for capturing our experience. There are also the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, a 2nd century CE Sanskrit text that maps the mechanics of consciousness with a precision that modern cognitive science is only just starting to match. Not yoga as physical exercise or something you do at the gym, but yoga as the systematic study of how attention works and what becomes available when it is trained. I might be getting weird, but there's also the Book of Job, which is not really a theodicy, not really a lesson about suffering, but one of the most honest documents in the entire Western tradition about the experience of having your explanatory frameworks destroyed by reality and being left with something that exceeds them. And there's also Ibn Rushd, I think that's how you say it, known in the West as Averroes, the 12th century Andalusian philosopher who argued that reason and revelation are not opponents, but complementary approaches to the same truth, and whose commentaries on Aristotle kept classical philosophy alive during a period when Europe had lost access to it. It seems like what connects all of them, across traditions, centuries, and incompatible metaphysical systems, is the same persistent intuition. That identity is more fluid than we're taught to believe. That meaning is not purely subjective. That inner life and outer world influence each other in ways that matter. That attention itself does something. That forgetting and remembering shape suffering more than we acknowledge. That human beings consistently sense more than they can easily explain. I don't think these books survive because they contain secret truths unavailable elsewhere. I think they survive because they describe experiences that people like you and me keep having, and because the dominant modern frameworks for those experiences are still somehow insufficient. Moments where identity loosens, moments where meaning feels participatory rather than projected, moments where inner and outer stop feeling like separate categories, moments of inexplicable recognition or grief that seems larger than its cause, or even love that seems to reach beyond its object. Modern language is catching up to these experiences slowly. Neuroscience, depth psychology, contemplative research, these are all making genuine progress on territory the old texts were already mapping in different vocabularies. But we're not there yet, and in the meantime, people keep finding these old books and feeling that specific, slightly disorienting sense of recognition. Once that recognition happens, it's very hard to unread it. That, I think, is why they keep finding people at the right moment, because they definitely know the right questions.